recalling what we did yesterday. So maybe just 2 points, two quick points. Yesterday I was talking about Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of carnivalesque, how it has a very important role in both new historicism and cultural materialism. By carnivalesque, we mean a temporary topsy-turvyism in the area of ranks. That means a particular social order may be based on a very strong sense of hierarchy, a very strong idea of rank. But at some moments, there is some kind of subversion of that authority, and there is a kind of disruption in that smooth maintenance of ranks. And so, what happens at those moments? Ranks go topsy turvy. Kings, nobles, and common men, some confusion prevails about their ranks at those moments. Many literary theories they have turned to the works of Shakespeare and some other Elizabethan playwrights to explore those moments of carnivalesque. And there in Shakespeare, especially the character of fool becomes very important because the fool sometimes says something which is very wise, which does not appear very wise, and he also has that kind of mocking tone. Similarly, you can see examples like this in other playwrights. So, element of carnivalesque, and it is not necessary that carnivalesque be confined to plays. Carnivalesque can be seen in novels also, in other works also. So that is one important idea about carnivalesque. The other idea that I discussed, and there we were talking about implications of Foucault's work for new historicism. And there we mentioned three important aspects. One important aspect was that idea that when you look at history, you'll find that literary and non-literary discourses, they can influence each other. And so this gives us the idea of parallel reading, where we subject different texts, not necessarily literary texts, to the same kind of rigorous analysis, right? But yesterday we had discussed at length the idea of canon, how canon was attacked, how canon was also expanded. And when canon was expanded, it was because of the insights that came from Foucault's work, and also because of the work of new historicists and cultural materialist critics, along with feminist critics and post-colonial critics. So basically, it was the work of post-colonial critics, feminist critics, new historicists, and cultural materialists that canon was expanded to give representation to very different kinds of voices from different worlds. And those voices can come from people belonging to different genders, people belonging to different classes, people belonging to different races, people belonging to different regions, different nationalities. And so we, instead of having a canon which confined itself to great works produced by English writers or American writers, the canon was expanded to include Indian writers, Brazilian writers, South African writers, Nigerian writers, black writers, and of course, writers coming from different regions and different racial groups. So that was our discussion yesterday. Today, I would like to talk about cultural materialism, and I have repeatedly made this point that cultural materialism and new historicism, they actually share a lot of common ground. So even if there are some differences between cultural materialism and new historicism, then those differences appear like differences within a family. So it is a kind of family tussle where cultural materialists may blame new historicists for certain things, and then new historicists answering, replying many of those questions and objections. So it is a kind of family tussle. Let us go back to the meaning and the connotation of the word historicism as it is used in new historicism and cultural materialism. Now here the word historicism has a kind of twofold focus. It has a kind of twofold focus. And what is that twofold focus? First, it talks about the context of the text. That means when that text was produced. So if we are studying a play by Shakespeare, then we are talking about the time period and the context of Shakespeare. So there Elizabethan period becomes important, other playwrights become important. In other words, 16th century becomes important. That is one aspect of historicism. That means when something was produced. And we have seen a lot of focus on that particular period in the work of new historicists. When Stephen Greenblatt studies a particular text, he relates that text to all those other texts, to all those different contexts of Shakespeare's time. But there is a double focus, as I said, in historicism. And that double focus refers to also the time and the context of its reception. That means when a particular critic is writing about it. So, for example, when Dryden was writing about Shakespeare, Dryden was writing about Shakespeare in his time. When Coleridge was writing about Shakespeare, Coleridge was writing in his time. That means that was the time of Romantic period. When Matthew Arnold was writing about Shakespeare, he was writing in 19th century. When new critics and some other critics were writing about Shakespeare, they were writing in the first half of 20th century and so on. And of course, when many cultural critics are writing about Shakespeare, then they are writing in their time. So the twofold focus of historicism means the time in which that text was written and the time in which this text is received. That means a critic cannot have a God's view of a text. A critic cannot keep himself totally detached from his time in his analysis of a Shakespeare's work, or for that matter, any other work. So the historical time in which something was produced and the historical time of the critic in which something is received, both these times, both these contexts become important. And a related question is, has the text meant the same thing at different periods, or has the meaning of the text changed over different periods? This question also is important for critics here. That means maybe what the text is saying, that is also part of contemporary debates about culture. So in our time maybe, or in the time of a critic, there are some assumptions, some hidden assumptions, and the text is also alluding to those hidden assumptions. So in cultural materialism, especially this dynamic aspect of the text becomes important, where it is not only the time when something was written, it is also the time when something is received, when something is written about, when something is commented upon by critics, and critics' own time becomes important. And the related question, has the meaning of a text remained the same, or it has also undergone changes over a period of centuries or over a period of decades? In cultural materialism, culture becomes a very, very key word, and it becomes a very, very inclusive word. And here the idea comes from Marxist criticism, because in Marxist criticism, material forces are extremely important. And what are those material forces? Say economics, economic factor, political factor, In other words, a text cannot transcend material forces. And because cultural criticism or cultural materialist critics are talking about material forces, so it often becomes difficult to distinguish their work from the work of Marxist critics. Because Marxist critics also talk about a text, a text not transcending the material forces. And that is why when New Historicism also first appeared on the scene, how was it mocked? And I recall those lines from one critic: a spectre is haunting criticism, the spectre of New Historicism. That means exact words of Communist Manifesto were parodied to attack New Historicism. There was one very important book, and this important book was Political Shakespeare. And this important book was, say, written by Dollimore and Sinfield. They offer a very interesting definition of cultural materialism, and their work actually has become seminal work in cultural criticism. So remember these two names, Dollimore and Sinfield. These are the two writers. So what they say about cultural materialism, that they are talking about, say, maybe a certain play, and they will talk about different contexts of its production. So if we are talking about a Shakespeare play, then different concepts of its production. So the economic system, the political system, and also the cultural system, all these become important. So for example, this question: who held power at that time? That means the institution of monarchy, that becomes important. What was the mode of economy? That means economic factor also becomes important. Which classes existed at that time? Was there a conflict between different classes? Which classes were considered important? Which classes held power? And where economic power also in a way was seen in collaboration with political power. But then the third factor also becomes very important. What were the institutions of cultural production? And here it means, say for example, the court becomes important, the theater becomes important, education system becomes important. And you know that when you are watching a Shakespeare film, say for example, if you watch a film like Shakespeare in Love, and I would like you to watch this film Shakespeare in Love. So it talks about the players who are playing those roles in Shakespeare's works. It talks about the theater. It talks about theater companies. And we also know that there was also an objection against the staging of plays. So there was also this religious dimension. And when a particular play is studied by a cultural materialist critic, he looks at all these questions. So court becomes important, monarchy becomes important, and monarchical power becomes important, economic power becomes important, and all these cultural productions, say how theater worked, who were the important actors, what was the audience like, whether plays were written for the stage or plays were also available in print form to be read. That means it is not simply one dimension, but all possible dimensions. They become important in our study of a particular play in Shakespeare's time. The second factor, the second dimension is also important, but because it is not simply a history of 400 years. When Shakespeare was writing his plays and when his plays were watched by others. Rather, cultural materialism is also interested in this question: how has Shakespeare come down to us? How has Shakespeare been appropriated over a period of 4 centuries? How has Shakespeare been received over a period of 4 centuries? What have been those different institutions which have tried to package Shakespeare, which have tried to market Shakespeare, which have tried to process Shakespeare, which have tried to present Shakespeare, which have tried to publish Shakespeare? That means it is not simply the movement of a text production and reception. It is also the history of these 400 years and all those different institutions which have played a part in making Shakespeare Shakespeare, which are important for cultural materialist critics. And this is one dimension of their work which is different from the work of new historicists. So, a cultural materialist critic is very much interested in the present. That means what is happening in the present. It is not simply the past, but also the present. So, for example, if today a particular play of Shakespeare is produced, then who's producing that play? Whether that play has been adapted, whether that play has been, say, presented in a manner in which it was presented to earlier generations, all these questions become important. So that means here it is not simply Hamlet, which Shakespeare wrote, it is also Hamlet's presentation in films. It is also Hamlet's adaptation in films. All those different kinds of Hamlets in all those different films which become important for a cultural materialist critic. And so it is Hamlet played by Laurence Olivier or Hamlet played by Kenneth Branagh, whether Hamlet presented by Russian productions is the same as the Hamlet produced by American stage, these questions become important. So it is not simply the past, it is also the present. And this also means it is not simply Hamlet, it is also Lion King. And recently also you had another version of Lion King. So it is not simply Hamlet, it is also Lion King. It is also Lion King as it was presented in the form of an opera. That is also important. And of course, it is also Vishal Bhardwaj and his Heather or his Maqbool or say adaptations of Shakespeare in different languages. All these questions become important. Or maybe if there is a particular headline about Shakespeare which is used maybe by somebody fighting a war or maybe say driving a car. So a loose remark, anything, even its significance can be worked out by cultural materialist critics because they are interested in this question how Shakespeare has been processed, how he has been packaged, how he has been presented, how he has been appropriated, how he has been reappropriated, how he has been adapted. All these questions become important. And here Sinfield and Dollimore, they also talk about four important aspects of cultural materialism. Four important aspects of cultural materialism. Now, what are those four important aspects? One is the historical context, and we have been talking about history all through. The historical context there becomes important. That means the meaning of a text is not timeless, but rather it must be placed in its historical time, a text. And when it is placed in its historical times, all those questions which I just mentioned, they become important. Second, and of course, here it also becomes important to see whether the text is saying something about the question of power, or if we recall our discussion yesterday, if the text is trying to say something about carnivalism or the authority at that time, the power at that time, did it try to suppress the element of the carnivalism? These are all important questions. So historical context is important, and here historical context refers to say economic, political and cultural, religious, all possible context. The second important say aspect which they mention, and I must talk about all those four aspects. This is historical method, historical context, theoretical method, political commitment, and textual analysis. What happens in theoretical method? Theoretical method means their approach is post-structuralist. Their approach is post-structuralist. That means if you are studying their work, then they will often use deconstruction. They will often use many other important theories work. And here I must mention some important theories. Althusser's concept of ideology becomes important there. Or Louis Mechre's concept of a reading which looks for gaps. Louis Mechre's concept of reading which looks for gaps, that becomes important. And even Terry Eagleton's say Marxist criticism becomes important. So theoretical method here means that their work is distinguished by their post-structuralist insights. Post-structuralist insights. And the third important aspect is the political commitment. Political commitment. You see, theirs is not a work which is not interested in change. They are greatly interested in the question of change. And their idea is that in reading a particular work, we are also intervening. So that way they have a kind of interventionist approach to a particular text. And political commitment here means they are especially committed to the question of race, class, and gender. Race, class, and gender. And that's why you see that many cultural materialist critics, they share their work with feminist critics and Marxist critics. And Marxist critics, they are interested in change in society, in change in the conditions of people, in change in the economic conditions of people. Right. Today, there was a very interesting write-up by Thomas Piketty, and he's talking about the challenges before the world after uh, coronavirus pandemic, I'm sorry. And he is say talking about a particular kind of socialism. What is that socialism? Participatory socialism, right? He departs from Marxism, he advances a different idea, and you know that Marxist critics are usually interested in the question of change in society. So political commitment refers to change in class, in economic conditions of people. On the other hand, feminist critics are interested in fighting patriarchy. That means all those patriarchal institutions which have so far prevented the progress of women. So here, political commitment refers to cultural materialist critics work along with Marxist and feminist critics, right? And you can also add post-colonial critics. And the fourth important element was textual analysis. Textual analysis. That means they try to back their analysis by evidence from the text. That means if they are talking about change, if they are talking about carnivalism, if they are talking about some subversion of authority, if they are talking about some challenge to authority, then it must be backed by a very close analysis of the text and by locating maybe relevant passages, relevant stanzas, relevant lines, relevant words, relevant aspects of the text, which provide the kind of evidence for this kind of study. So this is another dimension of their work, and as I mentioned, four important things. So historical context, which we have been discussing at length, theoretical method, it is post-structuralist, political commitment, it is interested in the question of change, and textual analysis, their analysis or their sense of commitment or their study must be backed by relevant portions of text. So that means, and here we can mention another beautiful construction, which was also used by another critic, that cultural materialism is a kind of politicized historiography. It is a kind of politicized historiography. Now, what is the meaning of politicized historiography? What is the meaning of historiography? Historiography basically means writing of history, right? It means writing of history. And the critic who used this term was, say, Graham Holderness. Graham Holderness. So, politicize historiography. That means they are never shying away from political questions. Here, we can repeat this point that cultural materialism has its focus on class, ideology, and economy. And that way, it is very much close to Marxist criticism. Now, cultural critics or cultural materialist critics, they also try to look for some fault lines, and this is the title of a work. They also look for fault lines in the dominant social orders. Fault lines, you understand, fault lines. So if there is a particular social order, and that social order may look very strong, very powerful, but there are definitely some cracks in that social order. There are some fault lines in that social order. So they are interested in locating, discovering, studying those fault lines, right? And here we can take an example from the work of Catherine Belsey. Catherine Belsey, Catherine Belsey identifies herself as a cultural materialist critic. She wrote one very seminal work, which was Critical Practice, which was one of the early textbooks of literary theory, right? So Catherine Belsey wrote a book titled The Subject of Tragedy, Identity Difference in Renaissance Drama. Now she reads Elizabethan drama, but at the same time she also reads many ballads written at that time. She also reads many, say, conduct books. Conduct books means which suggests you, say, how you should behave, how you should talk, how you should speak. Conduct books. And she also studied many political proclamations. That means where some speeches are made by people or rulers or by important people. And she also studied legal documents. That means here we are talking about a parallel kind of reading. And what she discovers is that a tragedy written during the Elizabethan period, it becomes a site of conflict, and it becomes a site of conflict between two different kinds of ideas. Say ideas which were medieval ideas of identity and ideas which were gradually emerging. And what were those ideas which were emerging? Ideas of modern capitalism. So in tragedies written at that time, you can see, and this is what say Catherine Belsey discovers, a kind of conflict. And the conflict is seen through two different sets of ideas in the work. A certain set of idea coming from the medieval period. That means a period earlier than the period when these plays were written. Another set of idea was the idea of modern capitalism, which will become important later, right? So here we see that Catherine Belsey discovers fault lines. And here we can introduce now two names yet again. One is the name of Michel Foucault, which we have discussed and which we will discuss again. Cultural materialist critics believe that new historicist critics did not pay as much attention to Foucault's idea of resistance. That means where Foucault talks about authority, where Foucault talks about power, where Foucault talks about, say, different dimensions of power, then there is also this idea that there is always resistance to that power. and resistance keeps the possibility of change always open. And since cultural materialist critics are interested in change, so the idea of resistance interests them a great deal. And so when they are reading a particular work, and they are also reading those fault lines in a particular order, then they keep in mind the idea of resistance. Was there any resistance to the authority? Was there any resistance to that authority? Was there sometimes a subversion of that authority? Was there a movement of carnivales? These questions become important. The other name is that of Raymond Williams, and he is a very important influence. Raymond Williams was, say, a left-wing British critic, a left-wing British critic. And here, especially two concepts of Raymond Williams become important. One is the concept of structures of feeling, structures of feeling, right? Structures of feeling, that is one concept. And the second concept of Williams is the idea of residual, dominant, and emergent aspects of culture. Residual, dominant, and emergent aspects of culture. I must speak about these two. When we discuss this question of structures of feeling, Williams does not use the word thought here. He's talking about structures of feeling. That means many things at a particular point of time are not properly articulated. They are not said clearly. And literature is often the site for these unarticulated feelings. Unarticulated feelings which present a narrative different from the dominant narrative of the time. That means a certain set of ideas which are not articulated at that particular time, but which can be felt, which can be read between the lines. And those ideas often pose a challenge to the dominant order of the time. So literature often gives such examples. And you know that in recent years, there has also been a subject called study of affectivity, or sometimes study of emotions also. How emotions and sentiments, they're also historically conditioned, how they're also historically made. So Williams is talking about those emotions, those feelings, those structures of feelings which present a challenge to authority, but they are not as clearly articulated. And so one has to read between the lines to understand them. So that is one important intervention by a writer maybe in the dominant culture of his times. The second important concept of Williams is the idea of residual. Residual means something which comes, which is left over, which is say residual, something which looks extra. Residual aspect of culture. And here try to think it this way. There is a particular kind of order, a dominant order, a dominant order, a dominant aspect of culture. But this dominant aspect of culture also includes some aspects of residual culture, that is from the past, and somehow this is also part of this dominant order. This residual aspect of culture is not archaic aspect of culture, but rather it is residual, means that it is not identified as such as archaic, it is not identified as such as very different. It is part of that dominant culture. On the other hand, dominant culture also includes some tendencies which are gradually emerging, which are coming up, which probably also challenge the dominant order. And maybe when these things emerge finally, the culture, the dominant culture will change. And here there is always this possibility of change. This possibility of change remains open. And so no analysis of any dominant order can exhaust all aspects of culture. Some are residual aspects of culture which come from the past, but which are nevertheless part of the dominant order, and some are emergent. So if we read, say for example, Measure for Measure, then you also have that idea of capitalism which is coming up, and Catherine Belsey also talks about that idea of, say, capitalism, which she can see in the works of Shakespeare or in the works of other Elizabethan playwrights. And at the same time, she can also see some medieval ideas. That means these are the ideas which are aspects of residual culture. So this is that is why cultural materialist critics, they are that way leaving the possibility of change. And maybe at this point I'll have to stop here, but just one point I must mention, that Catherine Belsey is also greatly influenced by, say, one critic, say Michel Peshu. And here quickly I must mention that Gayatri Chakravarti Spy work that is also in fact, I mean, say influenced by this kind of analysis. And so she also takes up this question of knowledge, power, and other things. So maybe I can stop at this point, and we are not meeting tomorrow. We will meet day after tomorrow. Thank you. Maybe you can speak, somebody, quickly. You don't have time. Quick. Yes.